Okay, so Discovering Buddhism, Module 3, Presenting the Path, Take 3. And this is a module where we're going to look at what exactly it means to be on a path. We're going to look at a bit about who the Buddha was and the Four Noble Truths in this session as the beginning of our module together. We're going to look at the Lam Rim, which is a series of teachings from like grade 1 to grade 4, whatever, scale, just a series of grades. And they're all paths. And I'm going to look a bit about Tantra at the very end as like another path. So we're going to look at all the Buddha's paths and present an overview of the entire kind of minds that we need to generate to enlightenment. And then the rest of the modules in DB go into those in detail. Right. So far in the Discovering Buddhism picture, if you like, we've looked at what the mind is. The mind and its potential was the first one. Then we looked at module 2, which is how to meditate, and just what meditation means in the Buddhist context. And just as an overview, a reminder of those modules in a nutshell: the mind is beginningless and endless, potential for enlightenment, clear and knowing, not physical, etc. Passes from life to life. That's module 1. Module 2 is how to meditate, and that's becoming familiar with the mind and its potential. Meditation, becoming familiar with these topics. That's the essence of meditation, becoming familiar with the positive, becoming unfamiliar more and more with the negative, lessening that balance and shifting from one to the other, and becoming more familiar with the mind and its potential, as I say, so we become closer to liberation and enlightenment, in a nutshell. And you can also do this course as just an observer, a participant, and just listen and join in as much as you can. If you want to do this module as a certificate student, that is also possible, in which case I will need to send you some information by email after this, and there's a completion card that goes with each module if you're interested. Has some little tasks for you to do throughout the 6 weeks, which just explain basically some reading you have to do, some meditations you have to do. You have to do a little discussion with me at the end to see that you understood it. And then I'll sign you off, and then you've completed this module, and you collect all the module completion cards together, and then you get a certificate for the whole course at the end if you're interested. That's only one way to do it. You don't have to do that. If you're interested, maybe send me an email on Slack or something later, and I'll send you that information. Or send me an email into my email address. Any questions on that before we start?
I was thinking, Kerry, I'm actually interested in the extra information that you've got on paper, but I'm not interested in the certificate. I mean, is it possible to do that?
Exactly, that's another option. Good suggestion. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I can send you all the information as if you were a certificate student, but you don't have to do it as a certificate student. You can just have the extra reading and the plot, if you like, and you can do what you want. Exactly, that's another option. Very nice, thank you.
Yeah, I think I'd like the same as well, Kelly. Same
Good.
thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think I know everyone here. Then, apart from Ruth, I don't know, but everyone else, I've got the email addresses already, so I can send that to you. Yeah. All right. As usual, we start with a motivation, and it's important we set a motivation so that this activity that we're doing becomes a Dharma practice, or becomes practice that's working for something other than just this life, becomes practice something bigger, something more universal for other living beings. So I'm just going to do a motivation, and then we'll start our class together. And the motivation is just basically a simple meditation we do together for 4 or 5 minutes, which I'll lead. And then if you feel comfortable, you can recite this verse that I'm going to put up on the screen in a moment, which is a traditional Buddhist way of starting a teaching using refuge and bodhicitta lines. For a verse of 4 lines, recite 3 times. So I'm going to share my screen with you now for the rest of this session, which just is how I work. It's helpful for my own mind. I'm not sure if it's any good for yours, to kind of just have these little slides with little bullet points and to remind me what to explain as we go along. And I can give you these slides later if that's helpful. So I'm now going to do that, if I can find it. Just one moment while I arrange some things in the background here. Okay, hopefully you can all see that screen. Just a thumbs up if you can see it. Yeah, okay, good. So here's the motivation that we're going to use. It's 2 verses there, but we'll probably just use the first one for now. So just find a comfortable posture for your meditation. We're aiming for something, that's reasonably supportive, which means you need to be stable, attached to the floor with good solid feet on the ground, or your knees if you're sat on the floor. And straight back, and feel so very free to breathe naturally and easily. And maybe in your own time, just take 3 deep breaths in and out through the nose in your own time. So then our motivation for these sessions together, and this session is to first of all think about refuge, which is a mind that understands difficulties of this life, understands difficulties of samsara as a whole, understands on another level that all living beings are experiencing difficulty and wants to do something to help. And it turns towards the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, what's called the 3 jewels of refuge, as a way to liberate ourselves from difficulties we're experiencing and those experiences that others are finding difficulty with. Turning towards the Buddha as an enlightened being, the Dharma as the actual method to liberate, and the Sangha, those on the path to enlightenment, but not yet Buddhas who are able to help. So if we're a Buddhist already, we would use that as daily practice, that mind of refuge. So that's the first 2 lines we recite. That's a whole module in DB later. And then the last 2 lines are bodhicitta, the mind which thinks that all living beings are experiencing difficulty. We have a close connection with those beings, which we understand as more we study and meditate. And we take on the responsibility to become enlightened for their welfare, because by being enlightened ourselves, we can really help others in the best way. We'll have no obstacles to helping them from our side. We'll know everything that's needed. That's quite a brave mind. That's one of the advanced minds, and that's a module in DB later on. That's like one of the last modules. But we can do our best by generating the wish to attain that state for the sake of others already. Even just thinking about these topics is extremely beneficial for us beginners. So that's the last 2 lines. So let's recite this verse together. Let's do it twice in English and then once in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chedang Saki Chornam Lai Janchu Badu Dagni Kapsuchi Dagi Chenyangi Pesanamgi Drola Penjir Sangye Drapara Sho. Okay, so here we go with the slides. And this is just how I like to start each week, just explaining where we are with the grand scheme of things on the map, if you like, of where we're going. And week 1 is where we are here with Buddha, who is the Buddha? What is an enlightened being? And who particularly was this Buddha Shakyamuni who lived 2,500 years ago? And his first teaching, the Four Noble Truths, that sets up the kind of blueprint for everything that happened with the teachings on the path. Week 2, we're going to look at the lineage from how the Buddha's teachings get to us, here in 2021 from that time. And particularly looking at a part in the middle there of that lineage where we look at a master called Atisha, as he developed a system called the Lam Rim, where we get this graded series from beginning, from step 1, step 2, step 3, a series of teachings which are really helpful. And that's how a lot of the education programs in FPMT would have this blueprint of the Lam Rim from the small, middle, and great scopes. So we're going to look at that, like that map, if you like, in week 2. Week 3, 4, and 5, then we'll be looking at those 3 steps in detail. There's a preliminary bit, and then the small scope, middle scope, and great scope. And each of those scopes is divided into how you generate the motivation of that being, that person on the scope, and then the practices that being will do on that scope. That's week 3, 4, and 5. And then week 6 is looking at Tantra, which is another type of path the Buddha taught. And then a summary of the whole module in week 6. Yeah, so it's pretty straightforward, that one. So here's a quote by the Buddha to start us off with. Abandon negative actions, create perfect virtue, subdue your own mind. This is the teaching of the Buddha. So that is quite a famous quote that's actually used a lot when I've had teachings from different Geshis and Lamas over the years. That's a verse that keeps coming back as a kind of route to ground ourselves in exactly what the main teachings of the Buddha are. Yep. It goes along with explaining that don't harm others is the main one, right? If we can help others, that's another step. That's like step 2, if you like, but at least don't harm sentient beings. And a lot of the negative actions that are explained in the beginning are ones that would harm other beings, like to refrain from killing, refrain from stealing, etc., refrain from abusive language, those things that would harm others. So that's kind of, important first step, abandoning, at least get a control of abandoning things that would harm others. And then if we can, then we flourish with developing the minds like love and compassion and wisdom and kindness and generosity, create those perfect virtuous minds, or negative virtue. We're just talking here about the distinction between minds that are creating positive karma and minds that are creating negative karma. And that's important for the small and middle scopes, because that determines where you end up in the whole samsaric picture. Those first 2 scopes, as we'll look at next week, are about looking after yourself. And the great scope is then thinking that applies then to all beings. Subdue your own mind. That's a good one, right? So that's a really important one. Subduing the monkey mind. Sometimes this unenlightened or untrained mind is called like a monkey mind. Have you ever seen those monkeys dashing about in India? The only time I've seen them in the wild is in India, northern India, where I spent some time around the Dalai Lama's temple. But they're quite crazy, and actually they become quite vicious as well. So if you're wandering around the streets with a backpack, they'll come and just grab stuff out of your hand, or a rifle in your bag, and actually they'll come and attack you and take your food. So you have to be quite careful. Actually, they're not as sweet as they look. And if you see the baby monkeys, they're just dashing about like crazy. It's like they're all hyperactive. I know kids are always like hyperactive, but these monkeys just bouncing around from tree to tree, dashing into pools of water, running around, scarping up trees. And that's a bit like, the uncontrolled mind. It's kind of dashing about from one thing to the other very quickly. You can't really grab a hold of it and anything specific for too long without moving to another thing. So it's quite a good analogy. And actually, one of the pictures of describing the way the mind moves from its uncontrolled state to a calm abiding, this level of really controlled meditative state, is often depicted as a monkey. So that's interesting. Have you heard that before? The monkey mind? That's quite, you might come across that as you do some more reading. So subduing the mind is really important. And what that comes down to is adjusting the balance between the positive and the negative, and moving towards more of the positive minds, because in the end, that brings us happiness and liberation. And after all, that is why we're here, to be happy, right? So let's look at some of the details of who was this person called Buddha Shakyamuni. So I may be repeating this for some of you, but I think it's important we all have some understanding of this from the beginning. There's some books you can obviously read more details about this, how we start here, but for example, in the required reading, oh, it's not in the required reading, it must be another one of the handouts that I've got, which I'll send to you. There's a book called Old Path, White Clouds, which is a very nice representation of the Buddha's. It's quite a thick book, but that's a really nice one to get to grips with the Buddha's story. And it's a really important place to start in our Buddhist study, is connecting with this person called Buddha Shakyamuni, who lived and started this tradition. We shouldn't forget that, because it tends to get lost sometimes in all the other explanations we do, but I have to remember it comes from this one being, and remember the kindness of this one being who started in our time, this tradition of path to enlightenment. So he was born as a prince in 563 BCE, before the Common Era, or BC, before Christ. That date is often, said slightly differently in different texts, depending on how you read it. I'm not sure the latest scholastic explanations of the exact date, but that's one I read in this material for DB preparing. So, you may find some differences. There isn't an exact number that I know of that everyone agrees on. Born in around northern India, around the border between present-day India and Nepal. It wasn't then. At that time, it was small kingdoms of royal families. Sometimes they got on, I guess sometimes they didn't. And a kingdom, wasn't like United Kingdom. It was a much smaller operation than that. And he wasn't a Buddha at that point. So we're not calling him Buddha, we're just calling him a prince. He was born to a royal family. And there's a life story that says, there was a sage, a soothsayer, however we're going to say it, an oracle, who kind of prophesied that this baby that had been born to this king or queen was destined to become one of two things. He was either going to be a great ruler, a great king, or an enlightened being, enlightened Buddha. So the father got quite excited, being a worldly guy. He was quite excited. Great, well, forget the spiritual thing. I just wanted to take over my job and be the greatest king ever, and take over the whole country and expand my empire, etc. So the father was quite excited about that. Not so much about the spiritual thing. So that's what actually then, the father kind of concentrated on. He kind of protected the baby, if you like, and then the junior, the adolescent, etc., from the external spiritual world, so that he would develop as his father wanted. So he was protected to some extent, and actually that worked against him in the end, as we'll see, because in the end we found out it became more shocking. So anyway, during this time of growing up, he was married to Yashodhara, his wife, and then had a son called Rahula. He was said to be quite quick and intelligent at learning things, mastered all these arts of astrology, drawing, archery, these things that a prince would need, I guess, to be a ruler. And then, at some point in his late 20s, he started to get curious finally about the world outside, and then kind of managed, in some of the films you see about the Buddha, you see that he actually escaped the palace walls, as it were, into the surrounding village, where suddenly he was encountering then the real, as I put here, tragic realities of life. This is Nick Rebush's words. You'll get some handouts for. And that's quite a nice way to put it, because for the first time, this young prince sees, people who are seriously sick. If you've ever seen, sickness in India, it's quite different here. We have, in India, you see quite regularly people on the streets with limbs missing, pulling themselves along, begging, etc. Quite desperate situations. And you can imagine what it was like, in those days. So that was quite shocking. He hadn't been exposed to that much kind of, challenging physical pain, because that had been hidden from him, as a prince. Old age, I guess, his father must have protected him from that also, and just moved only young, beautiful women and men in front of him. And he hasn't seen so much of the older generation. So to see people really, really old and almost passing away would be quite a shock. And then to see death itself, they're quite graphic in India, as you may know. So these are the cultures about presenting death. The bodies, they burn on piles by the river, by the Ganges, right? So to see that would have been quite shocking. So seeing these, what's called these 4 signs, there's 3 of these 4 signs, actually generated in him this aspiration to end these sufferings. And that is quite a leap. And that's not something, to be taken for granted, that understand, because I often think, to make that leap to suddenly deciding that you can end that or you can get rid of it takes quite a profound, imagination and a understanding perhaps of what's possible and isn't. Most of us just think, oh, well, that's how it is, let's deal with it. But for this young man to actually think, well, actually, I can end that, is central, is key to understanding the Buddha's message of liberation. That those things, sickness, old age, and death, can actually be abandoned completely. When we talk about death here, we're talking about, uncontrolled death, not as it would be for great realized masters. That's quite unusual, right? So, moving on then to this 4th sign, a wandering monk or a mendicant. A monk isn't quite the right word, maybe, yogis, sometimes they're called, usually wandering around naked in India. They were respected as great sages, great holders of wisdom and meditation. And there's a wonderful tradition in India, especially in the Indian subcontinent, of that tradition of just wandering around in the forest, meditating on these great minds and being able to have the respect of the local villages who provide for them, often a way to do that. So that's quite special. And he sees this, wandering mendicant wrapped in a robe, probably one sheet, as you see monks in Thailand. And it inspires him to then follow this path, because motivated by this aspiration earlier and combined with now seeing this the way that he actually do it, he renounces his royal life, tells his father that's it, leaves his wife and his kid and says, I'm come back later, but for now I've got to, focus on this spiritual path, because my aspiration to help these beings, help all beings, remove those sickness, aging, and death is so overwhelming, I have to do it. So he cuts his hair, which is a sign of royalty, gives away his jewelry, his royal clothes, just takes some, miserable piece of cloth, and that's it. He goes off and finds some teachers who can teach him about this spiritual path. So his father must have been in conniptions. He must have been livid after all that. So then 6 years, the Buddha was still a prince, well, not a prince, but a yogi now, I suppose, renounced his princely life. 6 years, he kind of bounces around from one teacher of meditation and spirituality to another. And what happens is, the Buddha is quite, this point, not a Buddha, sorry, this prince is quite a sharp meditator and a spiritual practitioner. So he goes to one teacher and he kind of quickly gets the levels that these teachers are at, and then says, okay, well, I've got to this level now. Then what? It's great while I'm in this blissful state that you're in, but then when I come out of it, there's still sickness, there's still the possibility of aging and death. So you haven't got the answer for me. So he moves on. Kind of respectfully, I imagine. He thanks the teacher for what he's learned, but then he moves on to another person who's got more advanced levels of realizations, meditations, etc. So then he'll learn everything that person, and quickly he has quite an aptitude for it. So quickly he learns everything this other person has, and then again finds it's blissful while he's in those states of meditation. When it comes out, he's still back where he started. So he goes through this a few times, going from teacher to teacher, you know, more renowned and more skills he learns. He's learning all the time, of course, but he still hasn't found the answer to what he needs. So then, you know, by this time, he's found 5 companions who are also on this journey, and he learns with these 5 companions. And the 5 companions and Shakyamuni decide to follow a more extreme path, which is to really renounce everything they can possibly renounce to kind of get away from the world as much as they can to be able to liberate themselves. So that comes down to, in this story, hardly eating anything and drinking anything. It said at one point he just eats like 1 grain of rice a day. And if you see those statues of Buddha when he's going through this aesthetic stage, you can count the ribs, the very skinny, emaciated Buddha. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has a statue. If you look in the teachings, he has a statue of this Buddha in the background. And that, you know, is like the other extreme. So the one extreme was the kind of worldly life the Buddha found himself in to start with. The prince found himself to start with all the pleasures, all the wealth, all the power, all the women, all, you know, all the food, everything he needed. That was one extreme. He renounced that. And now he's gone to the other extreme, which is like completely renouncing everything, so that he makes himself ill and so weak that he finds he's not even able to meditate anymore. He's just, you know, desperately ill and weak and frail. So that doesn't work out either. So that's an important part the Buddha's showing us here, is the difference between these 2 extremes of finding a middle way between 2 extremes. Oh, that's an important part of the process. So his 5 friends kind of, you know, despair when, you know, he's offered some rice milk by this girl by the river, and he finally, the Buddha, it just takes this and restores his health and his vitality, if you like. And his 5 friends are kind of like, oh, forget it, look, you've just given up, you know, and they wander off and leave him. At that point, the Siddhartha finds himself in Bodh Gaya. Once he's restored his health a bit, he sits under this tree, which we now call a Bodhi tree, awakened tree. And then after some, you know, stages of meditation in which he realizes that actually this self, which has been trying to meditate, trying to find liberation, and that finds itself different and separate from everybody, doesn't actually exist at all, was all just a mental projection, liberates himself from all the obscurations in the mind and becomes a fully enlightened being, an awakened being, which is a Buddha, awakened Buddha, right? And then the first thing he does is he blisses out. Apparently, he just blisses out for 7 weeks. Lama Yeshe says, you know, he deserved it after all the effort. And he doesn't want to teach. There's some reluctance to the Buddha to teach at that point, because you can see how complicated it's going to be to explain to sentient beings, and how, you know, to explain these spiritual realizations just by language and text is meaningless, because people have to experience it for themselves. So he's kind of a bit stuck, and he decides not to teach until he's persuaded by the gods, apparently, and they persuade him to teach. He says, look, a lot of them have a lot of difficulty, but some of them won't have a little dust in their eyes. I think that's the phrase that's used. So then the Buddha agrees to teach, because it might be of some benefit. I suspect the Buddha always intended to teach, but it has to be that what Buddha's teachings becomes clear is that, you know, you wouldn't give teachings unless people asked. That's a tradition that comes, that's a lesson that comes from this. And Tibetan tradition also follows that as much as we can. You don't give teachings unless people ask for them, because, you know, they might not be ready, or that you might just be listening for some strange reason, you know, that you force them there. It's not going to go so well, but it's not going to have any benefit at all, really. But if they have some openness and willingness on their side to be able to want to listen, then it's going to really work. So then, you know, we explain Buddhism, however. So that's the lesson we're learning from here. So everything in the Buddha's life actually has a real meaning. That becomes clear as we go along. So then the Buddha taught the first thing, which is the Four Noble Truths. And actually, you know, when his five, I've ever heard any stories by Bob Thurman. He explains his story very nicely. He says, you know, his 5 friends suddenly see this awakened being, but they didn't know that then. The 5 friends who left him, and they see him and they say, "Oh, he's that creepy Shakyamuni." Look, but when they see him, they can see there's something different, something's changed, and they're intrigued. And the first people that the Buddha teaches these Four Noble Truths is these 5 ascetics that he spent time with. So they're the first recipients of the teachings. So that's quite special. So for 40 years, then the Buddha taught around northern India, created a sangha, a community of monks and nuns, and then passed away at the age of 80 in Kushinagar in India, where they have this wonderful sleeping Buddha statue there, which you can visit. In a nutshell, that's the Buddha's life story. Let's look at some of the details then of what the Buddha first taught. The Four Noble Truths. So you may have heard these before. The first noble truth is the noble truth of suffering. Second, the noble truth of the cause of suffering. Third one, the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. And the fourth one, the noble truth of the path to the cessation of suffering. So it gets quite long at the end there, doesn't it? But you can do it in a brief way here, which is what is explained in the Heart Sutra: suffering, origination, cessation, and path. Notice the word there, path. Dun, dun, dun. So everything the Buddha's teaching here is to get to number 3, and the methods are number 4. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? There's a sequence here, which you may have noticed. The first one is the result. The second one is the cause. The third one is the result, which we'll explain in a minute. And the fourth one is a cause. So let's go back. So there's the result, which is what we experience, the suffering, and then there's the cause. So there's the result first, then the cause. So that's the first 2. And that explains samsaric existence, if you like. That explains the nature of unenlightened existence. And the 3 and 4 are kind of the way out. Third is the end of it all, the liberation, the enlightenment. And the fourth is how we get there, the cause. Yep. And there's very specific reasons, you know, psychologically why the Buddha taught it that way. It's because that's how the way we work psychologically, the way we practice. First of all, we notice that we experience difficulty, and then we'll look for why. Yep. So if we're ill, we go, oh, I'm suffering, I'm in pain, I'm in difficulty. Why? So then we go to the doctor to figure out why it is for a cure. That's just the way we work, isn't it? We wouldn't work the other way around. You know, in that experience. And then the doctor tells you, you can be free of it completely. You just have to do this medicine or follow these instructions, which is the 4th noble truth, and then we liberate ourselves from the suffering, from the headache, from the whatever disease, yeah, from the pandemic with the vaccine. The noble truth of cessation of the pandemic, that will be later on in the year, number 3. But how we get there is, you know, with the vaccine, which is number 4. Technically speaking, 3 isn't a result, because what we're talking about here is a cessation or an ending of suffering and the afflictions. The affliction is what we're removing, and the seeds of the afflictions. And what's left is what was already there, this kind of clear, pure nature of our mind. So the cessation, because the cessation is a technical thing, cessation is a permanent phenomena, and permanent phenomena don't have causes in the sense of cause and effect, because they are, cause and effect only applies to impermanent phenomena. But you can say they're dependent on. That's another way of saying it, perhaps better. It might come up later if you do the basic program, some of these little technical issues there. The way out is described to me, for example, if we're, Geshe Jampa Nalanda explained it this way once, which was very nice. If you're washing a car, the car is completely covered with all this mud and grime, and and you're cleaning the car, taking off all that mud, doesn't cause the clean car as such, because the clean car is there underneath. You didn't make the clean car by removing the dirt, you just kind of revealed it, you know. So to say that you caused the clean car is a bit strange in that sense. You could say it in one sense, but you know, you might get stuck in debate with that one. Yeah, just a technical thing, because that come up, lamas mention that a lot when they talk about the third and fourth noble truths. So when you hear some teaching some lamas, you might understand a bit where that's coming from. Another way of looking at the Four Noble Truths is each of the Four Noble Truths has 4 aspects, making 16. But we're just want to put those here for you for imprints, because that may come up in more detail later. Impermanence is interesting to note, is the first one. So you could say the very first thing the Buddha taught was impermanence, because the first noble truth, the first aspect, was impermanence. And there's a very nice sutra that we can read called the I don't know if I'm going to get it right, the first turning the wheel sutra, I think, where the Buddha goes to this pattern of explaining the Four Noble Truths, which is in Geshe Tachi's book, I think, on the Four Noble Truths. Anyway, so we can say the first thing the Buddha taught was impermanence, and the last thing the Buddha taught was impermanence, because he passed away showing gross impermanence. So that's sometimes interesting to think about. Some details then. So the important things to remember is to kind of get an outline. A lot of DB is just about learning the outlines for you to do some further study and reading. That's, I think, my main purpose here, is just to give you some outlines of topics and then give you a chance to understand the map at least. So when you hear first noble truth, suffering, there's 3 types of suffering: suffering of suffering, suffering of change, and all pervasive compounding suffering. Suffering of suffering is very obvious, right? It's just if you have a headache or pain or an illness, etc., those suffering are sufferings. Very straightforward, right? Nothing special about the Buddha teaching that. Suffering of change is more difficult to explain. Gets a bit more philosophical there, because the kind of temporary pleasant feelings that we get are considered suffering in the end, because they change and let us down. They're not reliable. So they're suffering in that sense. So suffering might not be the right word at this point. You might want to say more like dissatisfaction or lack of fulfillment or something. But, you know, these temporary pleasures are not long lasting. They're not real happiness. So the Buddha puts them under the category of something to be abandoned, because they're ultimately not enough. All pervasive compounding suffering is where all the other levels come from. And this is kind of unique to the Buddha's presentation here from other spiritual teachers, because the very fact that we have a body and mind is predisposed to the other 2 types of suffering is suffering in itself. So that's going to take some explaining, but just get an idea that the suffering of suffering, suffering of change, all pervasive compounding suffering, 3 types of suffering to be meditated on in retreats, for example, to really understand the nature of samsaric existence. Second noble truth, the origination, where it all comes from karma and afflictions. And what that comes down to is the afflictions, because based on afflictions we engage in actions. Karma means action. So if you're angry, you will end up hitting somebody. That's a gross example of an affliction causing an action. From that, you imprint a negative seed in the mind, which will ripen a suffering for you in the future. So this is where it's all coming from, comes down to the afflictions. And of all the afflictions, all the afflictions come from the root, which is ignorance, misunderstanding how you and phenomena exist. And based on that, we grasp, based on that, we push away. And those are the 2 categories of afflictions in essence. Cessation is the good bit. Now, if the Buddha had just explained the first 2 noble truths, and that was it, you know, better he just keeps his mouth shut and not say anything really, because it's too depressing. But because there is a third noble truth that says actually you can end those, then it's more, you know, useful for us. A state of an elimination of ignorance, the cause, which leads to liberation and enlightenment. So that's the good bit. That's that bit I mentioned earlier when the Buddha saw, you know, these examples of sickness, aging, and death, and he thought, actually, I'm going to work to liberate beings from that. And here it is, the Buddha found it. and explained it as the third noble truth. So the Buddha discovered that it is possible. We have to discover that from ourselves, you know, not just believing it because the Buddha said it. That would just be, you know, showing a lack of intelligence and an analysis on our part. We have to investigate it, see if it's true. But he says it's true, so well, let's take it as a hypothesis and figure it out for ourselves. It's worth investigating, right? If it's possible. And liberation and enlightenment, 2 levels of liberation from samsara, and then enlightenment is liberating ourselves from all the afflictions in the mind. Liberation still has a little bit of afflictions left. So there's a little bit of obscurations in the mind left, but you're out of samsara. But it's not the full liberation, which is enlightenment. So there's a difference between liberation and enlightenment. If you're liberated, you're an arhat, a foe destroyer. If you're enlightened, then you're Buddha. So there is a difference there, just to make you aware of that. And how you get there is the path, the 4th noble truth. Traditionally, it's explained as a noble 8-fold path. Does anyone know the noble 8-fold path from memory? Anyone want to say any of them? What they remember? I'm not sure if I can remember.
Right view.
View is one, good, yeah.
Right meditation.
Right.
Right livelihood.
All right.
Right speech.
Speech, another one, yeah.
Right mindfulness.
Mindfulness.
Action.
Yeah.
Right concentration.
Concentration, that's another one, yeah. I learned them in a specific order with specific translations, so maybe you know different. Right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Anyway, we might look at those when we get to more teaching on the path later on in the course. Lamrim meditations, they're all paths. Wisdom realizing emptiness is the real one we need to get out of samsara. So when you hear path, what you have to think about in Buddhism is you have to think a path is a mind leading us to cessation. It's a mind that's leading us towards liberation and enlightenment. It's not a place. It's not an actual path we're walking on. It is a positive mind. Yeah?
Yeah.
I don't always see, I just saw you, Jake, by chance there, but if you've got questions to mute yourself and put in, because I don't have a view of everybody on my screen. So yeah, Jake, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to ask, is that like comparable to like the Tao? Because I think that's the way, as in like the path.
I can't, because I don't know I know how teaching on the Tao, so I can't.
Okay.
Outside my remit, I haven't had any teachings on that, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can anybody else help Jake with that? No, so sorry, I can't help you.
That's cool.
But if you know about the Tao and you know what I've explained as the mind as a path in Buddhism, then you'll know if it's the same or not, won't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just wondering, that's all.
No, sorry, I can't help it. And just as the root of samsara, being stuck in suffering, is ignorance, the supreme liberator, if you like, the supreme mind that's going to liberate us is the wisdom realizing the opposite, wisdom realizing emptiness. Those two kind of liberation and the being stuck, if you like, the minds that liberate and the minds that keep us in samsara. Yep. I can't remember what the slides have got. Okay, so here's your time to discuss. So the discussion point here is, do you think it is possible to be free from suffering?
Yes.
So that's your discussion. So what I usually do at this point is I divide the groups into 2 or 3.
Can I ask a question before we go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Could you say a bit more about the third type of suffering? I find I can't hang on to that one.
Yeah, sure. That's the all-pervasive compounding suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, the Dalai Lama explains it, a few ways. One time I heard him say, or read him say, the very fact of being unenlightened, that's a way to describe the third type. The fact that you're unenlightened is the third type. So maybe it'll help you. So another way, Lama Zopa explains this a lot in different teachings on Lamrim. So pervasive, because it pervades in a number of different ways. The suffering pervades this life, future lives, and past lives. It's always been with us. The negative karma and the afflictions. It pervades in the sense that it kind of causes samsara, and it's a result of samsara. It kind of compounding, or because it creates more suffering in the future. It kind of compounds. It kind of produces more and more suffering. There's a very nice analogy that Tsongkhapa uses to explain these three levels of suffering. Do you want to hear that? Is that helpful? So it always helps me, this analogy. Analogy is really good, aren't they? Sometimes they don't do it for me, but this one does. So suffering of suffering is like you got, imagine you've burnt your hand, and the pain that comes from the burn of that hand, is the suffering of suffering. Very obvious, right? If you put on some kind of cream, what do they call those creams that of burns? I can't remember. What was it? Chamomile cream.
Aloe vera will do.
Aloe vera. Okay, let's say aloe vera then. So you put on some aloe vera. Aloe vera is like the suffering of change. Yeah. So it feels pleasant because you've stopped the pain temporarily. And you go, oh, it's blissful. But it wouldn't be blissful. Well, anyway, just so it's blissful, and you're thinking that, but it's only temporary and it won't last so long, and you have to put some more until it heals. But the very fact that you have the burn at all is the all-pervasive compounding suffering. If you didn't have that, then you wouldn't need the temporary aloe vera to relieve the suffering. The very fact you have the hand in the burn at all is the real reason you have the cycle of the tense suffering and having to relieve it with some temporary stuff and blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Is that?
See, that's where I've gotten a medal over this, because I always thought in your third part of that the suffering was because of your reaction to it, not because of the thing happening.
Third part, you mean the pervasive compounded one?
Am I making things complicated? Sorry.
No, you're not.
It's not to do with how you're looking at it. It's to do with the fact that you have a body and mind with the afflictions. Just that fact is the reason why you have experience in all the others.
Yeah, so get rid of the afflictions and you're sorted.
Get rid of the polluted body and the mind.
And then you've no burn.
You have no suffering of suffering, have no suffering of change, you'll be liberated. In fact, have that predisposition to experience those, which is the polluted body and mind, means you're always going to be predisposed to experience suffering. I mean, you can't avoid sickness, you can't avoid aging, you can't avoid death while you're under the control of this polluted body and mind.
Thank you.
So some things to think about. Okay, a lot of information there. I felt like I was going a bit quick there, but I think it's important to at least give you some ideas for some more thoughts and some more reading. That could be, it's definitely a whole module or a whole series of teachings on the Four Noble Truths. But the Four Noble Truths is a blueprint for everything the Buddha taught afterwards. So if you learn that, blueprint, everything can fit into that map, that blueprint. Everything the Buddha taught for 40 years fits into that sequence. It'll fit into one of those, where the Buddha's explaining different things. So let's have a discussion time. I think it's important you get to discuss and get to talk a little bit. So how many, we just lost somebody, I didn't know who we lost. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we'll do 2 groups of 4. I'll put you into little breakout groups. Let's discuss for 6, 7 minutes, something like that. The question is what? I can't remember now. Something about is the end of suffering possible? Something like that.
Do you think it's possible to be free from suffering?
That's the one. Do you think it's possible? The third noble truth. You can talk. These discussions are supposed to be very, free to give your own points of view. Don't just feel you have to recite the party line. You can say what you feel. It's important to discuss openly. Okay, I'll put you into breakout groups. Just click on the link. It says join the breakout groups when it comes on your screen, and you'll get a notification to come back shortly. I'll just stop the recording.
Must be believing it, really.
Yeah, I mean, you can use Buddhism just for the happiness of this life, just to kind of make yourself a bit calmer, a bit wiser, a bit nicer to people, and a bit less neurotic, more in control. I mean, that's perfectly possible, you know, but that's only using like a small part of what the Buddha was explaining is possible. And if you're not ready to think about past and future lives, then forget it, doesn't matter. But you can use just something in this life and get something benefit right now. So you're absolutely right. And that, you know, if you're not, you know, convinced that the Buddha's going to bring you, Buddhist system is going to bring you any happiness, then why why do we do anything if it's not going to make us any happier?
And I also think that, I also think that the very fact that we're learning this and we're sharing this and doing all these wonderful things online now, especially, it's sort of taking the edge off it all anyway, because the impact of suffering, we see it differently, don't we? There seems to be a reason. I mean, there seems to be possibly karma ripening or things, that life lessons we need to learn. That we personally, I look at it differently since I've been really involved in this, and so it's already happening. I'm on a long path, but it's already happening.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, okay, nice to hear your thoughts. Thank you, everybody. And we just have to keep remembering that as we go along, that, you know, the Buddha does want us to be happy. You know, on different levels. The Buddha's explaining different levels of happiness. Some we'll be ready for conceptually, some we're just not ready for conceptually, but at least we know that the Buddha had that on his agenda at some point to leap into further levels of happiness that we maybe can't think about right now, but at least we can get a grasp on the beginning levels, which is to be a kinder, wiser person right now. And that's, if that's where we are, it's a good place to start. But in the end, the Buddha is saying that you can be completely free of having to take a body and a polluted mind at all, ever, unless you want to. And that you can, you know, take complete control of having to be sick, having to be angry, having to be depressed. You can get rid of all that completely. That is the ultimate, what the Buddha found right at the beginning of his journey. You know, he was motivated by this profound aspiration and found it was possible, and then spent all his time explaining how to get there yourself. So that's good news, especially in all the strangeness of, you know, global pandemics and lockdowns and uncertainties. To know that actually there is a way out of all of that. Not just the temporary, you know, solutions like vaccines and become healthy for a little while, because it'll all collapse in the end anyway, but to be free of the system completely. That's why I always think the Matrix is a good explanation of, you know, samsara and nirvana. You know, we're trapped in the Matrix, and to realize that you are trapped in the Matrix is the liberation, and then you can be like Neo, flying around and liberating others. So if you, I always tell that to younger people, and then the kids at school that I teach, for example, or I used to teach, now the schools are closed, but they don't know what the Matrix is. It's like, I forget, it's quite an old film. So maybe you're with my generation and know about the Matrix. I heard there's going to be another one, actually, number 4. Anyway, so advertising for the movies. Anyway, that is the end then of the discussion and the class this week. And usually what we do at the end is we also end with a short meditation together, just to kind of dedicate any positive imprints in our minds that we've created, any positive karmic seeds, because thinking and doing positive actions creates positive seeds in our minds, which then ripen as something positive for ourselves and others. And if we can dedicate that, or kind of decide that is going to go for full enlightenment, for the liberation of all living beings by our full awakening, that is really then using that investment wisely. We've got something to invest now, and if we choose to invest it in something not like Bitcoin, it's going to crash, right? There's something that's going to bring a return, guaranteed return, multiplied by millions and millions and billions and infinite number of sentient beings. So that's the point of dedication, is to just dedicate all that positive karma we've created. And it's so special that you spent the time thinking about something other than, you know, the usual where am I going to get my next meal from? Or, what about my job? What about this relationship? Trying to step out of some of that worldly stuff just for a little while and think about bigger, more connected, emotionally impactful, positive things for ourselves and others. That's really special. So you should feel very positive and reinforce that there's a really special thing to do with your time. And dedicate all the positive karma you created for your full awakening so that you too can become a Buddha. This is where we verge from other religions, not criticizing, but just saying the difference, that you are able to become a Buddha. It's quite shocking for other religions. It's like saying you can become God, and that's quite scary, perhaps, for theistic traditions. But that's the ultimate message here. You also are becoming a Buddha. You're on the path. So I advocate that you too can become a fully awakened being and help others. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
That's Discovering Buddhism, Module 3, Session 1 of 6. Next week, we'll be exploring what it means, the Lam Rim, and looking at the different sections, what exactly Lam Rim is, the outline of that, and how that's going to work for our benefit and for others' benefit. Next session. I'll put this on video onto YouTube a bit later. If anybody wants, well, I've got almost everyone's email here, which I'll email materials to if you want them.
Yeah.
Except Dane's, I don't have of yours. If you're interested in that material, I can email that to you. Just maybe send me your email via the chat here personally, or send me an email to smile@gemangleads and I'll get that to you. It'll basically just be required reading if you want to do the module, some suggestions of meditations you could do, a nice bit of presentation of the Lam Rim from Dr. Nick Rebush, who runs the Lam Yeshe Wisdom Archive, the completion card if you want to know what's happening there. And what else have I got? I think that's it for now. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening.
Thank
I'm
you.
doing Bodhisattva practice in about 15 minutes. Everyone is interested, just for half an hour. Otherwise, we'll see you all again next week, hopefully. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Have a
you.
lovely evening. Bye
Thank
now.
you.
Thank you, Dane. Got your
Thank
email.
you. Bye, everybody.
Next week.
Bye.
Have a good week.
And you.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.